Hi, this is Ben with Novolux Stereophonic, and today at the bench I have a freshly restored Pioneer SX-1250. While I have the unit up here at the bench for final verification testing, I thought this would be a great opportunity to shoot a couple more technical videos. So I'm going to be calling this video my 2 cents on SX-1250 bias. This is not going to be a video on how to measure and adjust the bias. We're just going to be looking at what happens harmonically at various bias levels. So if that sounds interesting, stick around. Okay, before we get started, I just wanted to review how the test equipment is connected. So I'm measuring DC volts across the bias test points here. I'm going to be adjusting this trimmer throughout the video. That is the one that adjusts the bias. We can view the bias level on the bench meter here. The distortion analyzer is feeding a low distortion sine wave into the auxiliary input of the SX-1250. Volume control is about 50%, so I'm controlling my output level directly from the distortion analyzer, but it is feeding through the preamp. The output of speaker A is connected across an 8 ohm dummy load, and then that is monitored by the oscilloscope, and I'm also feeding the output of the distortion analyzer into the scope as well so that we can see the distortion products in real time against the output signal. So on the scope, blue trace is the output of the right channel only. We're only testing right channel. And then the purple trace is going to be the distortion products. I'm going to start by turning the bias all the way off. Now, usually on an amplifier, if you turn the bias all the way off and you run a sine wave into it, you're going to get a severe crossover notch. That means as the waveform is passing from positive and then coming through the zero crossing and back to negative, there'll be a flat spot in the middle. That's where crossover distortion happens. I'm going to turn on my oscillator here, and we will see on the scope that I have a single portion of a sine wave there. And if you look closely, you'll see right here, there is, on this purple trace, there's a little notch. I'm feeding basically the output of the distortion analyzer. It's showing me the distortion products and displaying that on the scope. So if we were to zoom into this waveform, let's see, I gotta get on this channel. At this point in the purple trace where it's showing that notch, I'm not seeing anything on the blue trace at all. Basically, the SX-1250 idles at a level where the crossover notch is not really visible on an oscilloscope, but it is with a distortion analyzer. So if I start bringing up the bias, and again, this is just I'm feeding an input signal, and that's giving me a 1 watt output. If I get into the trimmer here and I start turning up the bias, we see that notch disappear from the distortion trace there. What we're looking at up here is just total harmonic distortion plus noise. And also we should be able to see that change a little bit. So if we look up there again, I'm going to turn the bias all the way off. See how the distortion is going up a little bit? But already we're at 0.03%. This is extremely low distortion to begin with. This is with no bias at all. So we'll bias it up a little bit until that distortion element near the zero crossing is gone. Now at this point, I'm going to go into an FFT. This is one of the things that is nice about this Panasonic analyzer that I'm using. So the thing that I want us to be aware of is what happens to these various harmonics here. So this is the fundamental total harmonic distortion of everything. We've got the second harmonic, third harmonic, fourth, and fifth harmonic shown here. So if I take the bias back down to 0 again, and let it sit for a second, we see the distortion rise. And we see especially the fifth harmonic is gaining amplitude. So more distortion elements are being introduced into the signal, and our little notch here has returned. So remember, the service manual says the bias at 100 millivolts. I've seen a lot of these that I know are untouched from the factory, and they'll test at about 23 millivolts. I've got them from other techs, and I've seen them set around that range. On Audio Karma, the consensus seems to be around 75 millivolts. So where do you think we are with bias right now? The meter says 80 millivolts DC, but that's not actually my bias. The bias is the idle. So if I turn off my signal, it only takes 3 or 4 millivolts of bias to overcome the crossover distortion. If we set it like this heatsink would eventually come down to room temperature and it would probably just stay there. It would be quite cool. Now, just for fun, let's start ramping this up and see what happens. So let's keep an eye on this display, both for distortion and the harmonic character. So I've taken it up there, and we can see this thing's doing math in real time, so it takes a while for it to calculate everything. But we can see our distortion dropping, and our harmonics are being affected. The fourth harmonic and the fifth harmonic are going down. And as the temperature and everything stabilizes, this distortion is going to continue to drop. And we've only gone up about 10 millivolts there with the sine wave. Let's see where it's sitting at idle. So we're at about 50 millivolts DC there. Again, I've seen a lot of these set around 23 millivolts. Oh, let's get a reference here first. So let's just give it a second to do some math and then see where this distortion figure is at. So let's just remember around 320, 325. That's at 50 millivolts. We're going to back this off. Let's go down to 23, like I've seen some units that I'm pretty sure have been set and they have not been touched in years and years and years. I've seen them come in with both channels biased at around 23 millivolts. Let's turn it on. So we had 3.00325 is where the distortion kind of was. And again, this is just at 1 watt. So we can see there is an improvement in distortion as we raise the bias. This one's sitting at about 0.35. So let's take it up to 75 millivolts, kind of the recommendation from a lot of the community on Audio Karma. Let's go about there. Turn my sine wave on again. And look at that. So the distortion has gone way down from that, 0.00325 level, and our harmonics are very, very low. So basically what's happening here, at least the way that I understand it, is that we are taking the output stage more into class A. The NPN side and the PNP side are both amplifying the entire waveform until we get up a little bit higher than that, and then we're going to go into what's called class AB. So a lot of times in modern amplifiers, you'll hear manufacturers claiming that this is a 100 watt amplifier, but it's class A up to 20 watts. This is kind of what they're referring to. It's like hot class AB bias. You're not having the transistors fully turned on into class A, but you're biasing it up a little bit so that at low listening levels, you are getting a kind of a class A experience. Let's see what happens if we take it up to 100 millivolts. So that's about 280.00280. Let's take this up to 100 millivolts. And look at that. There's not a very big difference between 100 and 75 millivolts, both for the total harmonic distortion level and the individual harmonics. And this is where we're getting into when it's good to bias a little bit hot and when it's getting to be a little bit too hot. So I'm going to take it back down to 75 and we're going to run that again. I mean, I guess when we're doing this right next to each other, there is a little bit of a difference, but this is all about a trade-off. You want to bias it high enough to overcome that distortion level that we looked at, but you don't want to bias it so high that you're just gaining tiny increments of distortion improvement, but making the heatsink hotter and hotter and hotter. So in this case, that 75 millivolt level seems to be a good compromise. It does definitely cool down the heatsink a little bit, and you're getting a little bit of that benefit of biasing above that crossover notch level to get you a little bit of Class A at low listening levels. Now, let's see what happens when we start ramping up the output power. I'm going to take it to around 10 watts. And look at this. The harmonics are almost not present, which is awesome. And what we'll see, I'm going to do another video after this on all about output power, clipping power, and looking at the distortion curves on this thing. So if that sounds interesting, stick around for the second video. Let's compare a couple bias points here. So I'm going to take it back up to 100 millivolts. We'll see maybe a little bit of improvement, but not much. And let's turn the bias full off. So that's with the bias trimmer all the way down. There's still some residual bias there. And again, we can see that we've got harmonics starting to creep in here. So that's a little bit about bias level on these. I mean, this discussion could probably go on all day, but the main takeaway is that there is a happy medium somewhere in between overcoming the crossover notch and not running it so hot that you're coming into the law of diminishing returns and you're adding excessive heat and stress to your amplifier without gaining much audibly. So I don't know exactly where this 100 millivolt level came from. It may have been an engineer at Pioneer, and that's where they wanted to run this thing. But again, I've seen these coming where I know it has to have been not touched since the factory, and both channels are measuring the same level, and it's well below that 75 millivolts. So it's still a mystery where this should be set. I've set them at 100. They run very hot, and it's not the greatest thing. It always sounds good, but it's going to be hot. I've had customers tell me when they've brought in a unit that was biased cold, and I serviced it and biased it a little warmer, they said, hey, it sounds a little bit different. But you know, they've been missing the unit for 2 weeks. It could all be in their head, so I don't know. So comment where you like to bias your SX-1250 and any technical thoughts below. And it'd be interesting to get everyone's opinion on this, and maybe change my mind to where I bias these. So I'm in the 75 millivolt camp. I work a lot in hi-fi stuff. I've listened to a lot of Class A amplifiers, and I buy into that. Let's give it a little bit of Class A juice and see what it does. So thanks again for stopping by the channel. If you like this content, please subscribe. And again, stick around if you want to see that video on output power testing.